Hi, this is Matt Baker. On April 18th this year, Jews around the world will observe Yom HaShoah, also known as Holocaust Remembrance Day. In today's video, I'm therefore going to talk about my wife's family tree, which includes many Holocaust victims as well as some survivors. Although I am Jewish, I am not ethnically Jewish. I converted after marrying my wife, who is ethnically Jewish. She belongs to a family known as the Yazvins, although the name is spelled and pronounced many different ways by different branches of the family. Throughout most of history, Jews did not use last names. Instead, they usually just used Ben, which means son of, or Bat, which means daughter of, followed by their father's first name. However, starting in the late 1700s, Jews in Eastern Europe were required to take last names for taxation purposes. At this point, my wife's family took the name Yazvin because they had originally lived in a town called Yasvoynia, which was pronounced Yazvin in Yiddish. Nowadays, Yasvoynia belongs to Lithuania, but during the 1800s, it was part of the Russian Empire. Like most Jews in North America, my wife originally didn't know much about her roots in Eastern Europe. She knew that her last name was connected to some Russian town, but like most people, she believed the widely held myth that last names were given at Ellis Island. Also, like many American Jews, she assumed that her family had escaped the Holocaust, since they had come to the U.S. before the two world wars. In fact, she thought that there were fewer than a dozen people in the world with her last name. She knew the name of her great-grandfather, Itzhak, or Isaac Yazvin, and she knew her uncle and cousins, but beyond that, she thought there were no other Yazvins. Boy, was she wrong. A few years ago, she became interested in genealogy and started to do some research. Her family is very typical of most Jewish American families, so my hope is that by sharing what she's discovered, it will help others who are interested in doing their own Jewish genealogy. And of course, my other hope is that everyone watching this video will gain a better understanding of the lasting impact of the Holocaust on individual families and the world. So the first point I want to make is that the Holocaust cannot and should not be seen as just some isolated horrible thing that happened in Germany during World War II. The truth is, the Holocaust was simply the climax of a hatred towards Jews that had been around for centuries and that had been growing steadily throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. By this point, most Jews in Europe had long since been kicked out of other European countries and were living in an area of the Russian Empire known as the Pale of Settlement, an area that roughly corresponds to what is today Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. So although many of the Jews who ended up in America were called Russian Jews, note that most of them weren't actually from the area that we call Russia today. For over 100 years before the Holocaust, there was an intense persecution against the Jews known as the pogroms. The pogroms were riots condoned by the Russian Empire, in which mobs of non-Jews were allowed to attack, rape, destroy the property of, and even kill Jews. It was because of these pogroms and the extreme restrictions on Jewish lives that many Jews ended up migrating to New York via Ellis Island around 1900, including my wife's great-grandparents and their children. My wife's grandfather, Henry, was just 5 years old at the time, but for the rest of his life, he carried a scar on his forehead that he got when he was kicked in the head by a Russian soldier's horse. Now, unfortunately, there is a stereotype that leads many people to think that most Jews are super rich. However, that's simply not true. And when it comes to the Jewish families that settled in New York's Lower East Side during the early 20th century, the opposite was actually true. Most Jews arrived with next to nothing and lived in crowded conditions for decades while they struggled to rebuild their lives. And I should make it clear that anti-Semitism, both then and now, is not simply a form of religious persecution. Most Jews are Ashkenazi Jews, which is a very distinct ethnic group. Hatred toward Jews has thus always been more about the ethnic difference than about religion. Okay, the second point I want to make is that almost every Jewish family tree includes Holocaust victims, even if the person at the bottom of the tree doesn't know it. Many American Jews assume that their family escaped the Holocaust because their direct ancestors arrived in America before the World Wars. This is in fact what my wife thought before she started doing research. But here's the thing. Most of the Jews who came to America had close relatives that stayed behind. And sadly, family branches often lost touch with one another, especially once the Holocaust happened and once the Soviet bloc became cut off from the rest of the world. Survivors often didn't want to pass on the horrors that they had witnessed or knew about to their children. And for those living behind the Iron Curtain, communicating with relatives in the West was simply too dangerous. However, by doing some genealogical research, family branches can often be brought back together. The three resources that have helped my wife the most in doing this are JewishGen, the Tracing the Tribe group on Facebook, and the database of Holocaust victims at Yad Vashem. I'll leave a link to all three of these sites in the description, but for now, let me tell you a bit about Yad Vashem. In Hebrew, Yad means hand, and Shem means name. And therefore, Yad Vashem expresses the idea of carrying the names of Holocaust victims forward into the future so that they will not be forgotten. When my wife entered her last name into the Yad Vashem database, she was surprised to find several entries mentioning her great-grandfather Itzhak. Although he was not a victim of the Holocaust, he ended up bearing the responsibility of reporting several of his close family members as victims. Yad Vashem reports often include the names of a person's other family members. So my wife was able to quickly learn that Itzhak's father's name was Abel and that Itzhak had at least 5 siblings. So that's 5 family branches that she hadn't known about. These 5 branches were all impacted by the Holocaust in fairly typical ways. So as I go through them, not only will you learn about my wife's family, but you will also learn about the Holocaust in general and how the average Jewish family was affected. I'll start with the descendants of Wolf Yazvin. Wolf actually died just before the war, but he had several children, including Benjamin, also known as Benya. By 1941, Benya was a widower living in Lithuania, right on the border with Germany, raising his 2 youngest daughters, Rivka, age 18, and Minna, aged 13. Their older sister Rosa, aged 21, was studying at college in nearby Vilnius. World War II was in its second year by this point. However, the Holocaust had not yet really begun. Instead, many Jewish refugees were still trying to flee Germany, some through Lithuania, which was now controlled by the Soviets. Benya helped many of these refugees, often hiding them on his property, even though it was considered illegal to do so. Although some date the start of the Holocaust back to January 1933, which was when Hitler came to power, others use June 1941 because that's when the systematic mass murder began. It coincided with Nazi Germany's attack on the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa. At this point, the Nazis and their collaborators simply started to massacre Jews in huge numbers, starting with the men. In his town, Benya heard about these plans while spying on the Nazis and their Lithuanian collaborators. He was unable to warn anyone, but was able to avoid being shot himself by hiding for many days. In fact, he was the only Jewish male from his town who survived. But the Nazis and their Lithuanian collaborators didn't just stop with the men. They proceeded to kill all the Jewish women and children as well, including both Rivka and Minna. Often, Jews had to lie naked in a ditch, sometimes on top of corpses, and wait to be shot. So take note, not all Holocaust victims were murdered in concentration camps. At the beginning, many were simply executed en masse, sometimes by their own neighbors. Over the next 6 months, about 200,000 Lithuanian Jews were massacred. Only about 1 in 20 were able to escape. Benya's oldest daughter, Rosa, was one of those who managed to get out of Vilnius just in time. She spent many months on the run. What began as a train journey soon became a foot journey after her train was bombed. She started with a suitcase, but over time lost all of her belongings, including even her shoes and her glasses. Often, the Germans were just a few miles behind, but she and many others continued forward, sometimes carrying each other. Eventually, she made it to Russia and met up with a group of partisans. Partisans were ragtag military units within the Red Army who helped resist the Nazi onslaught. Rosa ended up joining the Red Army herself and served for 3 chaotic years. After the war, she got married in an Italian refugee camp before moving to Israel, where she lived until age 89. Her full Holocaust testimony is available online, so I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. Also murdered during the initial 1941 massacres were Rosa's uncle Moshe and her cousins Sarah and Riva, and her aunt Hannah. There were probably more relatives in this branch murdered as well, but that's another sad truth of the Holocaust. Many records were lost and or destroyed, so that not everyone's fate is known for sure. Later, after the war, the Soviets sometimes used Jewish headstones as paving stones and built new buildings on top of what had previously been synagogues, which is where many records had been stored. Another one of Rosa's cousins, Itzhak, escaped the initial massacres. However, he was later captured and sent to Dachau, one of the most notorious concentration camps. He survived, though, and is in fact still living, currently aged 97. We were able to talk with him over Zoom recently, and he repeatedly exclaimed that my wife looks just like his female relatives that he knew before the war. He was especially struck by her curly auburn hair, which he called the Yasvin hair. He unfortunately lost a younger brother during the Holocaust, named Abel. We're not sure exactly how Abel died, but just recently a record was added to Jewish Gen, indicating that he was being forced to work in the Kaunas ghetto in 1942, and that he had been punished twice for minor offenses. Ghettos were parts of a town or city that were basically made into makeshift prisons. And note that I said that this record was added just recently. Amazingly, even though it's been around 80 years since the Holocaust, records are still being discovered and transcribed, so Jewish genealogy is still very much a work in progress. During the war, Itzhak's father adopted a young boy named Enrique. As you can imagine, such adoptions were quite common at the time, since so many children were left orphaned. There was also a fourth brother named Peter. He ended up living in Russia after the war. My wife's great-grandfather Itzhak had 2 other siblings who died before the war, but both had children who were murdered in the Holocaust. Bela's daughter Rivka was living in Paris with her husband and 2 young boys when the war began. However, when the Nazis captured northern France in 1940, they quickly arrested all the Jews and sent them to internment camps. 2 years later, the family was sent to Auschwitz, where they were murdered along with 1 million other Jews. Also murdered at Auschwitz was Benjamin's daughter Hannah. The exact fate of her sister Nechama is unknown, but she too was murdered at some point. Itzhak's youngest sibling was his brother Hirsch. His exact fate is unknown, but he presumably was murdered during the initial massacres in Lithuania in 1941, and he most likely had children who were murdered as well. However, the branch that was hardest hit was that of my wife's great-great-aunt Sora. She herself died in 1941 in a Lithuanian ghetto, and all 7 of her children were murdered, along with at least 10 of her grandchildren. In fact, only 2 people in this entire branch of the family are known to have survived. One was my wife's second cousin once removed, Berka. He was outside of Lithuania when the massacres began because he was in the care of one of his paternal aunts, who had moved to Russia because she was a communist. And in Lithuania, being both a Jew and a communist put her in even more danger. While in Russia, Berka was made to do various types of forced labor until the end of the war. At that point, he was left with the task of reporting all his uncles, aunts, and cousins who had been murdered. He was young when the war started, so didn't know the names of some of his youngest cousins, something that plagued him for the rest of his life. His full story has been recorded as well. Once it's available, I'll leave a link to it in the description. Berka's cousin Moshe survived as well, as did Moshe's father, Yudel. Moshe had to make the difficult choice of leaving his father Yudel, who was on death's door after having been in the concentration camp, to go search for his mothers and sisters, not knowing that they had been murdered in a camp for women and children. He ended up getting arrested for not having proper documentation, even though by that point, most Jews had lost everything, including basic ID. By the time he was released, the window of opportunity to leave Russia had closed, so he was stuck there for many decades. However, Berka returned to Lithuania and met up with Yudel, and they in turn bumped into Benya. As you can imagine, it was a joyous reunion, as so many relatives had been lost and there were so few survivors. So now, if we zoom out and look at the complete tree for my wife's great-great-grandparents, Abel and Rasha, you can see the devastating effect that the Holocaust had on just this one family. Abel lost 2 out of his 6 children, 17 out of his 25 grandchildren, and at least 17 of his great-grandchildren. Obviously, had it not been for the Holocaust, he would have had many more descendants today than he currently has. This impact can be seen on virtually every Jewish family tree. Here's another example of another Jewish family, one that's related to Jarrett Ross from the YouTube channel Genie Vlogger. This chart makes it very easy to see exactly when the Holocaust occurred, because the tree is just decimated at that point and has to slowly start growing again. If you're interested in learning more about how this particular chart was made, I'll leave a link with more details in the description. Now, before I move on, I want to go back to the earlier point I made about how the Holocaust cannot be fully understood without seeing it within the broader context of anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism in the early 20th century was by no means limited to just Germany. Due to their very deliberate inaction, even the United States and Canada played a role in how many Jews ended up dying in the Holocaust. Throughout the 1930s, when Hitler was in power, and it was clear that Jews were being mistreated, the U.S. made it more difficult for Jews to immigrate to America, ignoring the desperate calls to make it easier. The most famous example was the ship, the MS St. Louis, which carried over 900 Jewish refugees to Cuba in 1939. Cuba, as well as both the U.S. and Canada, refused to accept the refugees, and they were sent back to Europe, where many of them ended up dying in concentration camps. Even after the war, most countries still made it difficult for Jewish refugees to get visas, which is why so many of them ended up in Israel or spread out all over the globe. This dispersion has had real-world consequences, even for my wife. In 2020, she almost died from pancreatitis and had to have her gallbladder removed. She has since learned that gallbladder disease runs in her family and that several others have almost died from it too, a fact that she probably would have known earlier if her family had been able to stay together in one place. Okay, I now want to share a few more stories from further out on my wife's tree. You see, her great-great-grandfather Abel had a brother named Ilya, who had several descendants who worked as photographers back when photography was still in its infancy. In fact, 2 of his sons, Wolf and Abram, became the official photographers to the Russian imperial family. All of the photos of various royals that you can see on screen now were taken by them. They had to get special permission to live in St. Petersburg because normally Jews were not allowed to live there. But even though this side of the family was better connected and more well off, they were not able to escape the horror of the Holocaust. One victim was this handsome man named Abram Yazvin, who was married to a woman named Dora, with whom he had a daughter named Lilia. They were able to put Lilia on a train just before Abram was murdered, and Dora was sent to a concentration camp. There, Dora was assigned to forced labor, but because she had recently learned that Lilia's train had been bombed, she threw herself into the line for the gas chamber instead. She did not know it, but Lilia actually survived and lived until 2015. And then there was this toddler named Bernard. His parents managed to get him smuggled out of a ghetto, and he went on to live with some Jews who spoke French. But one day, the Nazis came knocking. The little boy answered the door and said bonjour, as he had been taught to do, in the hopes that they would be assumed to be non-Jewish. But the ruse didn't work, and he and the others were murdered. His parents, however, survived and went on to have another child who my wife is currently in touch with. Being that this side of the family were photographers, there are many more photographs available of them, such as this one. In doing her research, my wife met a relative online from South Africa who had several unidentified photos of the Yazvin family. When my wife asked her whether she knew that her ancestor had been the photographer to the Tsar, she said, "Oh my God, you mean it's true?" So obviously she had heard the story but hadn't quite believed it. My wife was then able to help identify some people from the photos, including Dora, who I mentioned earlier. This has nothing to do with the Holocaust, but I want to point out this relative named Jimmy Payne, who was named Mr. America in 1950 and was a good friend of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Interestingly, a muscular physique runs in my wife's family, and when she was younger, she too was a weightlifter. Even now, although she has become permanently disabled, her muscularity helps her in that she can use her strong arms instead of the weaker parts of her body. Finally, there are two stories of survival that I want to share from branches whose exact connections to the tree are not yet clear. The first is that of Isaac Yazvin, one of only 3 people who survived the Grozovo massacre in what is today Belarus. In this case, 2 large pits were dug in the forest, and the adult Jews were required to stand in the pits and wait to be shot. The children were then thrown into the pit and buried alive. Isaac lost his wife and 2 children that day, but after the war, he remarried and had more children, one of whom my wife spoke to on the phone just the other day. Then there's Esther, who gave her Holocaust testimonial, which is now included in an online database of Holocaust survivor stories. She describes many horrors in her account, including escaping rape, another atrocity that was common during the Holocaust, but is often not talked about. Near the end of the war, when the Nazis were about to murder everyone from the camp, Esther and her brothers escaped and ran door to door in Lithuania looking for refuge. Dozens of locals who had known the children all their life refused to take them in, but finally they found a family that did. That family was helping to hide several Jews in their field and would send out their own children to deliver food and comfort to them. After the war, that family was named as one of the righteous among the nations, a record of non-Jews who, unlike most, were willing to help save Jews during the war. So that was a look at the Yazvin family tree. Interestingly, several members of the family from different branches have a story about relatives saying, if you ever find someone named Yazvin, remember they are your family. Happily, even though this family was torn apart by the pogroms, the Holocaust, and other tragedies, and ended up all over the world, including in Argentina, Canada, Israel, Latvia, Russia, South Africa, the UK, and the US, they have now been brought back together by genealogical research and social media. And the family resemblances have been mind-blowing. My wife has written more about her family research on her blog, so I'll leave some links to that in the description as well. I also want to thank two of my wife's relatives who are helping to put together Russian subtitles for this video. Since many of the people connected to this tree speak mostly Russian, we wanted to make sure that they could watch and understand the video as well. If they're not available yet, they should be soon. Finally, let me end by reminding everyone that while the Holocaust is now almost 80 years in the past, anti-Semitism is still alive and well, and in fact has been steadily increasing over the past several years. While it's certainly okay to criticize certain actions taken by the State of Israel or by individual Jews who behave badly, it is absolutely not okay to lump all Jews together and attribute certain characteristics to the Jewish people as a whole. Thanks for watching.